So this year's topic for my presentation is the practices of the three vehicles, and this is basically chapter 4 in Venerable Yin-Shun's book, The Way to Buddhahood. So over the years, my lectures here have been focusing on Venerable Yin-Shun's book, The Way to Buddhahood. And this is one of his seminal works, which provides us with a very detailed explanation from start to end. So back in 2022, during COVID times, we began with the first chapter on taking refuge in the Triple Gem. So 23, we looked at chapter 2, significance of learning the Dharma. And chapter 3 was a bit sizable. So we split that over 2024 and 25 last year. We finished off. And so this year, 2026, we embark on chapter 4. Now, I'm estimating chapter 4 at least will take this year and next year, if not maybe a bit run over into the third year to come as well. But we'll just see with the conditions and how they go. Okay. So in terms of chapter 4, this is the very high level structure of chapter 4, and it's split into two parts. So there's part 1, which focuses on the foundation of the three vehicle path. And then there's part 2, which is the sequential stages of cultivation. So this makes up, these two parts make up the two major divisions in this particular chapter. Now, even though we've got part 1 and part 2, part 1 is actually quite succinct, and it covers pretty much just the first verse. So for those of you who are not aware, Venerable Yin-Shun's book, The Way to Buddhahood, is in a very classical format where he's got verses and then he explains it in prose. Now, the verses are a way to help us basically, even though it's been written very beautifully, the verses are written very beautifully, but the aim is to help us recall all the content in the prose. So the first verse in chapter 4 covers part 1, and then the remainder is all part 2. So in terms of our, in this talk, part 2 is then further split into 3 sections. So the first section is what we call subject. So here, subject refers to the target audience and the doctrine. So namely, the target audience is the Sravakayana practitioners, and the key doctrine is the Four Noble Truths. Now, the next part is, excuse me, the next part is the practice. So this refers to the key methods of practice suited to the target audience following the key doctrines. And in this respect, it's namely the 3 trainings and the Noble Eightfold Paths. Now, the last section, the results, refers to the goal. So the content here is the actual goal of the Sravakayana path, which are the 4 fruitions of the Arahant. And at the very end, it also includes an explanation of the Pratyeka Buddhas, because effectively their attainment of liberation are the same. So the only difference is with the Pratyeka Buddhas, they can attain liberation without a teacher, because they've got the spiritual capacity to be able to understand emptiness and causes and conditions purely through their own effort and practice. Whereas the Sravakayana practitioners, they can only get there through the guidance and teachings of the Buddha. Having heard from the Buddha, they then study and practice accordingly. So in terms of this year's target, we'll definitely won't be able to finish everything, but we'll definitely get, hopefully, somewhere to the practice stage. So we'll see how far we go, and what we don't finish will continue to be continued for next year. So now let us begin looking at part 1, the foundation or the core practices of the 3 vehicles. So practices common to the 3 vehicles are transcendental teachings. So within Buddhism, you've got the split of worldly teachings and transcendental teachings. Now, transcendental teachings are those that aim to end cyclic existence and ultimately liberation, to leave samsara for good. Now, these practices are established with the practices common to the 5 vehicles as the foundation. So basically what was covered in chapter 3 previously over the last 2 years is the practices common to the 5 vehicles. So a very important teaching that Venerable Yin-Shun stresses is that all these different paths are not separate. You don't say, well, I only want to practice the 5 vehicles, so I don't need to pay attention to the 3 vehicle or the 1 vehicle, and vice versa. Rather, he basically, he stresses that the 5 vehicles are the basic foundations of human morality. So just to be a good person, or if you want to have a heavenly rebirth after that, then at the minimum, you need to undertake the practices common to the 5 vehicles. But that then forms the foundation and basis for those to progress to the 3 vehicle and to the 1 Buddha vehicle or the Bodhisattva vehicle as their conditions and spiritual capacity advances. So basically what this means is that in order to progress to these transcendental teachings, we do need the virtues and merits of the human and heavenly practices from the 5 vehicles. Because if you can't be a good person, then how can you even think about getting to the point of a sage, which is the transcendental teachings? So you need to be able to fulfill the duties, the virtues of the lower realms, the human realms, in order to be able to then move to the goal of liberation. So for those of you who are joining and are not so familiar with the teachings, I'd suggest that you can go back and have a look at the previous year's recorded teachings. I believe they're on YouTube. So, or if you read the book, The Way to Buddhahood, that's also available. There's an English copy in print, and the Yin-Shun Foundation is in the process of preparing its official translation. So hopefully that'll be done in the not too distant future. Okay, so let us move to the very first verse of chapter 4 in The Way to Buddhahood, and it reads, "All conditioned phenomena are impermanent, and so it is said that all sensations are suffering. Reflecting on this truth, one aspires to leave and aims for the path of liberation." So this is the very first verse that begins chapter 4. And this verse captures the following key points. So the transcendental path of the 3 vehicles is grounded in the aspiration to leave this world. And so one must first learn to develop that aspiration. So only when when you agree with that goal of liberation, then you'll actually make effort to try and get there. If you don't agree with that goal, then of course you won't be interested in the transcendental teachings. And so how do we get ourselves interested in leaving this world and heading and developing this aspiration? We need to slowly realize that everything in this world is impermanent. Nothing is perfect, and there is no true freedom. So this is the way, this is a fact of our world. And what this means is that all sentient beings experience suffering. And only when we thoroughly understand that this world is unsatisfactory, then we will slowly develop the aspiration to leave this world. Otherwise, if you think about it, if you think this world is actually not too bad, I quite like it here, then there's no motivation to seek liberation. So what this is pointing out is that we need to understand the shortcomings of this world, and that motivates us to seek transcendence. So let us take the situation of our own ordinary experience. So in this world, there is worry and suffering, but there's also joy and happiness. And we also have some neutral experiences where we don't consider it painful, but we don't really think of it as being joyous. So we're a bit indifferent to it. Now, accordingly, based on our own experiences, we won't say that human existence is all unsatisfactory. But we need to understand that in Buddhism, when we hear the saying or the terms, this world is suffering, this is a philosophical topic, and it reflects a deeper view of this world. So in the sutras, the Buddha teaches that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. And for this reason, it is said that all experiences are regarded as unsatisfactory. So superficially, even though there are different types of painful experiences, joyous experiences, and neutral experiences, when we investigate these more deeply, we cannot deny that everything ultimately will get to the point that makes us unsatisfied. Even in our most happy times, it will come to an end. And when that comes to an end, we can either feel at a bit of a loss, or we want to try and recreate that situation to bring forth that happiness. So all of these aspects are what the word unsatisfactory and suffering is referring to. So, in our world, everything in this world, whether it is our physical or psychological states, or the external environment, our personal status, our family, and even the country we belong to, everything is constantly in a state of creation and change. And that's the fact of impermanence. And that's why in Buddhism, you will see the phrase, the world is suffering, or everything is suffering. So it's talking about it from the final end. So everything is created from the coming together of causes and conditions, and hence the description of state of creation is used. Now, everything that is in a state of arising and then ceasing, being born and then dying, being created and then decaying. So because we have these situations, we also get the description, the state of change is used. So anything that is in a state of creation or a state of change, this is what we call conditioned phenomena, or things, conditioned things. So when we refer to conditioned phenomena, conditioned things, or sometimes you might even see the term conditioned dharmas, it's referring to things that are constantly subject to creation and change. So that pretty much includes everything. Inanimate objects like the tables, the microphone, the computers, they may look impermanent for a while, but ultimately after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, they'll break down. Animate things, us as human beings, we are constantly changing through, our cells are creating and then dying and so forth. So if we look at ourselves from our baby photos, primary photos, high school, up until now, they're all us, but they're all different as well. So we ourselves are constantly in a state of creation and change. So everything in this world is subject to impermanence. Now, all these conditioned phenomena are impermanent, and that means they don't last forever. And when we view things from the perspective that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, naturally, any present worries and vexations, of course, become a form of suffering. So the Buddha calls this the suffering of suffering. So all the joys and happiness that we experience, such as wealth and glory, good health, intelligence and so forth, all these can bring us feelings of satisfaction. But once the conditions change, then suffering will follow. So we can lose our wealth, we can fall from glory, and even with intelligence, as we get old, we become more and more forgetful as well. So that can also be gone. So the Buddha calls this the suffering of decay. Now, concerning the neutral experiences of neither pain or joy, although such experiences are plain and ordinary, these two are not exempt from the states of creation and change, and sooner or later will lead to suffering. So this is just like a ship traveling across the ocean, heading to dangerous shallow reefs. So while the passengers on that ship may be drunk and oblivious to the danger, they don't experience pain or joy. Nonetheless, the situation they're in is still unsatisfactory. So the Buddha calls this the suffering of conditioned phenomena. So the fact that this world is conditioned, created through causes and conditions, that is suffering. So in summary, when we investigate things from the notion that all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, nothing is long-lasting and perfect, and nothing is guaranteed, then we cannot deny the truth that all experiences are unsatisfactory. And we can only admit that this world is like a house on fire, and the three realms are like a prison. So the three realms here refers to the desire realm, the form, and the formless realms. So when we study and practice the Buddha Dharma, hopefully we all eventually will gain a deep understanding that all phenomena are unsatisfactory. So you'll hear this at the moment, and it's just basically theory. But if you start to reflect on it in your daily lives, then hopefully that's when you gain a deep understanding and appreciation of what this means, that phenomena are unsatisfactory. And then, once you understand this, no matter how enjoyable an experience may be, you won't actually develop strong clinging and attachment to it, because you know ultimately it'll come to an end. So this is a bit like, going to your best friend's birthday party or wedding party. So you're very excited to go and you enjoy yourself there. There's nothing wrong with enjoying yourself, okay? So don't think that with all this suffering, there's nothing worth getting, excited about. Opposite is that enjoy what you have, but understanding that it is impermanent. Once the time comes to leave the wedding party, to leave the enjoyable situation, you won't feel that loss. You won't have that sense of loss. So you can let go. There's no attachment. And that's one way to not allow ourselves to get too upset when conditions change. So when you know that the conditions are going to change, enjoy it while you have it, and then let go gracefully. So that's one way to help you not unnecessarily take on the burdens of suffering. So even in the case where, one can gain birth in the heavenly realm and being able to enjoy all forms of bliss that the heavens have to offer, knowing that this ultimately is impermanent, then slowly you won't develop the interest to go there, basically. Because remember, we're trying to cultivate the aspiration to transcend samsara. So we need to look at all things that are enjoyable and slowly pick away at it and see the truth. So when you reflect on this truth, and slowly this will give rise to a resolute thought of leaving cyclic existence altogether. So after gaining such an understanding and developing such an intention, as you continue to study and practice the Buddha Dharma, this nurtures the aspiration and it becomes stronger and stronger. So how strong does this resolution need to be? When one sees that this world is truly not a peaceful place, when you see that it's not a final destination to stay here forever, then the thought of staying here forever becomes unbearable. Okay? So when you realize that this place is really no good, it may look impressive, but ultimately it's just full of suffering. So then you start to detest it and it becomes unbearable to have to stay here. So pretty much like being trapped in a house that is burning, you need to get out. And so when you see that these three realms, cyclic existence is like a burning house, then you'll be more and more eager to leave. And so this aspiration for cyclic existence arises and becomes very, very strong. And then you will aim for the great path of liberation and embark or become very willing to undertake a lot of the practices that lead you to liberation. Now, without such an aspiration, if you don't want to leave cyclic existence, you can cultivate all sorts of practices and accumulate many, many virtues. But because you don't have the vows to leave, all those virtues, all those merits are still only worldly practices. So they can help you gain a better future. They can help you gain a lot of good outcomes in this life and future lives, but they can't help you gain transcendence. So the vow, the intention to leave is very important. So when one possesses the aspiration to leave cyclic existence, then all their virtues will be guided by that aspiration, and it becomes the causes for their liberation from cyclic existence. So that's how you plant the cause for liberation. And this is called the wholesome root for liberation. So it's important to actually have that aspiration to leave. So you need to ask yourself, how strong is my aspiration? And if you go back to the last 2 years on the 5 vehicles, there's nothing wrong with aspiring to the human and heavenly vehicle at this stage, depending on, your spiritual foundation. There's nothing wrong with it. But you need to understand that a true Buddhist practitioner never stays at the basics. The aim is to progress. So once you nurture your spiritual foundation, then slowly you should consider and you should pay serious attention to then developing the aspiration for transcendence and not just, linger at the human and heavenly stage. So the aspiration to leave cyclic existence is the basis or the transcendental path. So all Buddhist practitioners who claim that they want to end cyclic existence, they need to reflect on this point and self-inspect whether or not they have developed that aspiration to leave samsara, to leave cyclic existence. So this brings us to a very funny story because there are many stories in the sutras and anecdotes as well. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the Pure Land practice. Okay, so there was this story of this practitioner, an old lady, and she chants Amitabha's name all the time, and she goes to the temples, and in front of the Amitabha Buddha, she'll pray and say, "Please come and take me to the Pure Land. I'm chanting very sincerely every day." Now, one day there was this young monk, novice, a little bit naughty, cleaning behind the statue, and he hears her prayers. So then he thought, let me give her a bit of a test. And so, being behind the statue, he tries to make this really, serious voice and say, "I hear your prayer. I'll come pick you up tomorrow night." And then that old lady says, no, I'm not ready yet. So it's obvious that even though lip sync, she follows what the teacher says and makes those prayers of, "I want to go to the Pure Land." But, when the Buddha is, well, not the Buddha, but the little monk is pretending to be the Buddha and telling her that, okay, tomorrow night, let's go to the Pure Land. And that transcendence, the aspiration for transcendence, actually isn't there yet. So we need to ask ourselves and reflect on, are we at that stage yet? Are we at that stage yet? And if we are, then, seek out the proper practices. But if you're not at that stage, it's fine to continue doing the human and heavenly practices, accumulating your merits and so forth. You can still learn about it, but don't, because sometimes when your actual spiritual foundation is at a bit of a mismatch, you can actually create more obstacles for your progression on the path. So honesty to oneself is very important on the path of practice. Okay, so that was part one, basically. So if you read the actual book, there's a lot more detail, but in essence, part one is a bit of an introduction to capture the importance of chapter 4 about the 3 vehicle path. The bulk of the material, as I mentioned, is in part 2, and that's where you have a lot of the details. So in terms of part 1, if you can't remember much, hopefully the key point to take away is the aspiration to leave cyclic existence. Have you made that aspiration? And how does that aspiration comes about? It comes about because you fully understand that this world, which is full of conditioned phenomena, is unsatisfactory. Okay, so now this brings us to part 2, the sequential stages of cultivation. So namely, after one develops the aspiration to leave cyclic existence, we then build on that aspiration. So we need to motivate ourselves to embark on the transcendental practices. And these are the transcendental practices of the three vehicles. So in terms of, you hear three vehicles, what exactly are we referring to? It's referring to the Shravakayana practitioners, the Pratyeka Buddha practitioners, and the Bodhisattva practitioners. But ultimately, when we go and look at the target subject or the target audience, you'll note that it's the Shravakayana. Among the three, this particular chapter, the target is actually still the Shravakayana practitioners. Okay, so in terms of the main doctrines and the audiences, even though we talk about the three vehicles, bear in mind that it's really referring to the Shravakayana practitioners. And that's similar to when we talk about the five vehicles, even though it includes all, the key focus when we mention the word five vehicles is still the human and heavenly vehicles. Okay, so part 2, subsection 1, begins with this small half verse, and it says, three vehicles are established based on intention. The main audience is the Shravakayana practitioners. So among those who aspire to leave cyclic existence and practice the transcendental path, their intention and spiritual foundations are not identical. And based on the different intentions of these individual practitioners, the Buddha established the three different groups of the three vehicles. So, as I mentioned, the three vehicles are the Shravakayana vehicle, Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, and the Bodhisattva vehicle. Or sometimes it's referred to as the Buddha vehicle. So, in the teachings, such as those found in the Lotus Sutra, in terms of specific teachings, it is said that the Buddha taught the Shravakas the Four Noble Truths, while the Pratyeka Buddhas were taught the 12 links of dependent co-arising or dependent origination. Sometimes you will see it written that way. And the Bodhisattvas were taught the 6 paramitas. Now, in fact, all transcendental practices aim to investigate the profound meaning of existence, such as the practices of the Four Noble Truths and the 12 links. They all look at what is this existence of ours. Now, as for the Bodhisattva path, the practitioners are more inclined to extensive practices, and that is captured in the 6 paramitas. So, among the practices of the three vehicles, the main audience, as I had mentioned, are the Shravakayana practitioners, and therefore the Bodhisattva and Pratyeka Buddha practitioners can be regarded as a bit of a side or additional audience when we're looking at this particular subject here. So, you might ask, well, when we talk about the three vehicles, why is it that the main focus is just on the Shravakayana? And Venerable Yin-Shun explains this through several methods. And one is that in the sutras, such as the Agamas, which are the Mahayana equivalent of the Nikayas, so the Nikayas are found in the Theravadan Tripitaka. In the Agamas or the Nikayas, you'll only find 2 bodhisattvas. And one is the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, in his past lives, while he was still practicing the path to Buddhahood. So by the time that Shakyamuni Buddha began to teach the Dharma, he had already become a Buddha. So in other words, the Buddha is the spiritual founder who taught us the Dharma. He did not create the Dharma. He just realized it and then shared it with us. So that's one bodhisattva that you will find in the Agamas and Nikayas. The other is Maitreya Bodhisattva. And this bodhisattva was given the prediction in one of Shakyamuni Buddha's assembly that he will be the next Buddha to come. So from these teachings, we can see that, you know, in the Agamas, you hear of many Sravakayana disciples, but you only see 2 bodhisattva disciples. Now, in terms of Pratyeka Buddhas, the mention of those are even fewer. So these practitioners have a spiritual foundation where they can awaken to the truth on their own accord without guidance from a teacher. So their spiritual foundation is such, and most likely it's accumulated from past lives of study and practice. But in this particular life, when they attain liberation, it's done purely from their own effort and investigation of the events around them. So that's why, as we mentioned earlier, they tend to be taught the 12 links because they observe cause and effect around them. So from this aspect, if you compare the teachings, the mention of Pratyeka Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are quite few. And so that's why the predominant audience is still these Sravakayana practitioners. Now, in terms of the paramitas, the 6 or the 10 paramitas, these practices are found throughout the Jataka tales. And the Jataka tales, of course, are referring to the Buddha's past lives. So through their practices and records of, you know, how the Buddha behaved in past lives, the ancient masters have drawn out these 6 or 10 paramitas or perfections. So in terms of the Buddha's own disciples, the Pratyeka Buddha category, one clear mention is Venerable Mahakasyapa. So he himself, it records that, you know, he did make a statement that he could have gained liberation with or without the Buddha. But because the Buddha was present, he chose to become a disciple of the Buddha. So this is one way when we analyze the sutras, we can get an understanding of who is the main audience, basically based on quantity in this sense. You know, the number of Pratyeka Buddhas and Bodhisattvas mentioned in these early teachings are few, but the large amount, the major target, are the Sravakayana practitioners, and there are many of those disciples mentioned. So in ancient India, the word Shravaka is a general term for the Buddha's disciples. So these people listen to the verbal teachings of the Buddha and subsequently awaken to the path. So sometimes the English translation of the word Shravaka is along the lines of the hearers, so meaning to hear from the Buddha directly, and then having had that contact with the Dharma, they then practice. So in some schools, there is a particular emphasis on the importance of meaning. And so the Tentai school calls the 3 vehicles the Tripitaka teachings, because it does include the Bodhisattvas and not just the Sravakayana practitioners. So remember, we're just saying that the 3 vehicle path is predominantly suited to Sravakayana practitioners, but it doesn't mean it's in the exclusion of, you know, you exclude out the Pratyeka Buddhas or the Bodhisattvas. Now, in terms of the Yin-Shun school, They call this the three vehicles. They call it the small teachings because of the fact that the major portion of the teachings are targeted to the Sravaka practices. So in terms of the entire body of teachings in the Buddha Dharma, as taught by Shakyamuni Buddha, the Sravaka practices do constitute a large portion of the teachings. However, from the aspect of the Buddha Dharma taught by all the Buddhas in the 10 directions and the 3 time periods, among those who cultivate the transcendental path, there are teachings and practices that belong to all 3 vehicles, the Sravaka, the Pratyeka Buddha, and the Bodhisattva. Okay, so from a Mahayana perspective, this world, the fact is Shakyamuni Buddha came here and his teachings and the conditions in ancient India, the prevailing conditions meant that the Sravaka practitioner population was quite large. But in terms of the Mahayana's understanding, there are multiple worlds in the 10 directions. And if we look at all the Buddhas and their teachings, then there are ample of teachings catering to both the Sravaka, the Pratyeka Buddha, and the Bodhisattva vehicles. So this brings us to the next verse and a half. Among the Buddha's Sravaka disciples, there are various grades of spiritual foundations. So this next verse summarizes the 2 main groups of practitioners based on their characteristics. So these are the monastic and householder Sravaka practitioners. And the verses say, the Buddha's path to liberation avoids the 2 extremes of enjoyment and self-torture, accommodating those who are inclined to indulgence. Householder disciples cultivate the righteous Dharma. Accommodating those who are inclined to asceticism, disciples renounce and become shramanas. Okay, so given the time, I've gone over by 2 minutes, so this is a nice place to stop at this particular verse, and we'll continue with this in this afternoon's lesson. Okay, so thank you everybody.